Alright, so I'm going to finish chapter 1 and then I'll start chapter 2. She marched through the house and up the stairs with her sister in tow. At the top of the stairs, they found a long hallway with 5 closed doors, 2 on each side and 1 at the end of the hallway. Sabrina yanked on the closest one, but it was locked tight. She turned and tried the door behind her. It opened to a bedroom decorated with dozens of wooden tribal masks, wild-eyed and smiling hideously. 2 ancient swords were mounted on the wall alongside the masks, and there were pictures of Mrs. Grimm and her husband Basil everywhere. Like the ones downstairs, each photo was of a different part of the world. In one picture, Basil was standing at the top of an ancient stone temple. In another, the couple were guiding a gondola through what Sabrina guessed were Venetian canals. She closed the door, realizing that this had to be the old woman's room. She tried the next door. Inside, Mr. Canis sat cross-legged on the floor, his hands resting on his knees. Several candles lit the nearly empty room, illuminating its sparse furnishings and a small woven mat on the floor. There were no pictures or decorations at all. Mr. Canis opened his eyes and turned to look at the girls, his eyebrows arched. Sabrina slammed the door without apologizing. "What a nutcase," she muttered. The next door opened to a queen-size 4-poster bed with their suitcases resting on top. Sabrina pulled Daphne inside and slammed the door. "That woman is hiding something," she said. "You think everyone's hiding something." "And you would hug the devil if he gave you cookies." "Well, I like her," said Daphne. She sat down on the bed and let out a harumph. Sabrina looked around the room. It was painted in soft yellow and had slanted ceiling and fireplace. A red 10-speed bicycle sat in the corner, an old baseball mitt rested on a desk, and several model airplanes hung from the ceiling. A nightstand sat next to the bed with an alarm clock perched on top, and on every wall were dozens of old photographs. A particularly large one showed 2 young boys staring out over the Hudson River. Sabrina went to the window and looked out at the porch roof below. She could probably jump off it and then to the ground, but Daphne might hurt herself. "Let's give her a chance," Daphne begged. "A chance to what? Kill us in our sleep? Feed us to that monster dog of hers? No way," Sabrina said. "While you were shoveling in those meatballs, did you ever think they might be made from the last couple of kids she claimed she was related to? Daphne rolled her eyes. "You're gross." Suddenly, Sabrina heard a faint whistling sound, almost like a flute, coming from outside the window. She peered into the dark forest behind the house. At first she thought she had seen something or someone sitting in a tree, but when she rubbed her eyes for a clearer look, there was nothing there. Still, the music continued. "Where is that coming from?" she said. And, like an answer to her question, a little light flickered outside the window. Sabrina thought it was a lightning bug. It flew up to the window as if it was trying to get a better view of her. It was joined by another light, and the 2 danced around each other, zipping excitedly back and forth in the air. "Amazing," she said. Daphne rushed to the window. "They're so pretty," she whispered, as dozens more lights joined the original 2. Within seconds, there were almost 100 little lights blinking and flashing outside. Without thinking, Sabrina reached up and unlocked the window. She just wanted to get a closer look, maybe grab a couple to keep in a jar in the room. But as she undid the window's latch, the bedroom door blew open with a crash. Startled, the girls spun around and found Mr. Canis looming in the doorway. "Girls, you'll leave that window closed if you know what's good for you," he growled. Mr. Canis stomped across the room, pushed the girls aside, and locked the window. The little lights outside flew around, bouncing off the glass several times, and buzzed as if in protest. A moment later, they were gone, and the whistling sound faded away. Mr. Canis turned and stood over Sabrina. Sorry, I forgot to announce this is the beginning of chapter 2. "You are never to let anyone or anything inside this house," he said in a voice as low and scratchy as an angry dog's. "It was just some lightning bugs," said Sabrina. Her face was hot and red with shock. Who was this man to think he could tell her what to do? "No one comes inside this house. Do you understand what I have just asked of you?" Mr. Canis said. The girls nodded. Very well. Good night. He stalked out of the room, closing the door behind him. Sabrina stood dumbfounded, trying to comprehend what had just happened. What was that all about? Daphne whispered, but Sabrina said nothing. She didn't want her sister to hear the fear in her voice. Since her parents had run off, Sabrina had had to be the tough one. Her little sister needed to know there was someone strong by her side, even if it meant Sabrina had to pretend sometimes. There was a knock on the door, and Mrs. Grimm entered the room. It's been a long day, hasn't it? Mr. Canis yelled at us, Daphne cried. I heard, the old woman said as she sat down on the bed. Please don't be too upset by Mr. Canis. He can be a little grouchy from time to time, but he has your best interest at heart. Believe me, Lieblings, we are both very happy to have you here, but there are a few rules you have to follow, she said, pausing as she looked into Sabrina's face. And I know that what I tell you might not make a lot of sense, but the rules are in place for a reason. First, never let anyone or anything into this house without asking Mr. Canis or me if it is okay, she said. Her tone was stern and serious and no longer that of the sweet, loving old lady with the funky spaghetti. Mrs. Grimm took the girl's hands in her own. Second, there is a room down the hall that is locked. It's locked for a reason, and I ask that you stay away from it for the time being. You might hear some unusual noises coming from inside, but just ignore them. Do you understand? She asked. The girls nodded. As for the rest of the house, feel free to explore. You'll notice there are plenty of books to keep you occupied. Really? Books? I didn't notice, Sabrina said sarcastically. If worst comes to worst, we can always dig out that old TV, Mrs. Grimm continued, as if Sabrina hadn't spoken. She got up from the bed and crossed to the door. She turned to smile at them one last time. Who wants pancakes in the morning? Daphne's face lit up. I do. Are you warm enough? Do you need anything to sleep in? The little girl opened one of the suitcases, then pulled out 2 extra-large t-shirts that read, Bermuda is for lovers. No, we have these, she said. Very good, Mrs. Grimm said. Good night. Don't let the bedbugs bite. She's nice, said Daphne when the old lady was gone. Sabrina clenched her fists. It's all an act. That woman is hiding something, and we aren't sticking around to find out what it is. Get some sleep. We're running away. Tonight. Sabrina lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to her hungry belly grumble, and planning their getaway. With a little luck, she and Daphne could hide in a neighbor's garage for a couple of days, and then hitchhike back to New York City. After that, she didn't know. In the past, they had just gone back to the orphanage, but this time Miss Smirt might act on her threat to skin them alive. The next place she sent them would be 1,000,000 times worse. The girls were on their own now. We have to go, Sabrina whispered to her sister when she was sure the rest of the house was asleep. Daphne sat up and rubbed her eyes but said nothing. Her heartbroken face said it all. Why is she acting like such a baby? Sabrina wondered. Running away wasn't exactly a new experience for the two of them. The sisters Grimm had pulled off several daring escapes from foster parents in the last year and a half. They had tied bedsheets together and climbed out of the Mercer's window one night, feeding their pit bull Diablo meatballs stuffed with cayenne pepper to keep him busy. And after the Johnsons had ordered pizza, the girls had slipped into the back seat of the delivery boy's car and were miles away before he even noticed them. Mrs. Grimm was no different than any of the other lunatics they had run away from. Eventually, Daphne would understand. When they were dressed and packed, Sabrina slowly opened the door and looked out into the hallway. It was empty, and as the 2 girls crept out with their tiny suitcases, she used her skills to the fullest. They tiptoed down the stairs, being careful to step close to the wall to avoid making them creak. At the bottom, Sabrina slowly opened the closet door so the latch wouldn't click, and the stack of books inside wouldn't fall over and wake the house. She snatched their coats, and the girls put them on, then walked to the front door. Sabrina was just thinking that this was the easiest escape they'd ever made when she tried to turn the knob. The door was locked. When she looked closely, she noticed something unusual that she had not noticed before. "There's a keyhole on this side, too," she said. They were locked in. "We have to find another way out." The girls crept through the house, doing their best to avoid knocking over any books. They tried all the windows, only to discover each had been nailed shut. They found a back door off the kitchen, but it, too, had a lock on the inside. "Let's go back to bed," said Daphne. "We have to go get her keys," said Sabrina. The little girl cocked an eyebrow. "How are we going to do that? She has them." "You'll see," Sabrina whispered. The sisters found their way back up the stairs to Mrs. Grimm's room. The door was shut tight, but Sabrina was happy to find there were no locks on it. She slowly turned the knob, and it swung open. The old woman's room was scary at night. The tribal masks they had seen after dinner were even creepier in the dark, and the swords mounted on the wall flashed a ghostly light around the room. Mrs. Grimm was asleep in her bed, unaware of their presence, and snoring loudly. Daphne had the same annoying habit. "Where are they?" Daphne said, only to have Sabrina's hand clamp over her mouth. "Keep quiet," Sabrina whispered. The old woman turned in bed, but stayed asleep. Sabrina scanned the room and spied the keys glinting in the moonlight on a table on the far side of the bed. She looked at Daphne, pointed to herself with her free hand, and then pointed to the keys. Daphne nodded, and Sabrina let go of her mouth. Sabrina took a small step forward to test for a creaky floorboard. This is going to be easy, she thought, but as her confidence was building, she noticed that Daphne had taken an interest in one of the masks on the wall. The little girl took it off its nail and held it against her face. "Don't do that," Sabrina whispered. "Why not?" "Put it back, now." The little girl frowned and placed it back on its nail. "There, are you happy?" she whispered. A split second later, the mask fell off the wall, landed with a loud clunk, and rolled toward the bed. Both girls dove to the floor as Mrs. Grimm sat up. "Who's there?" she asked. "Oh, it's you. What are you doing down there?" Sabrina was sure they had been caught, but the old woman leaned over, picked up the mask, and set it on the nightstand. "I'll have Mr. Katniss give you a new nail tomorrow." Then she fell back asleep. She fell back onto her pillow, and within minutes was snoring as loudly as ever. "You did that on purpose," Sabrina seethed. "Whatever," Daphne whispered, and rolled her eyes. Sabrina scowled. Was her little sister trying to sabotage their escape? Sabrina crept around the bed to the table, picked up the keys, and then tiptoed back across the room and into the hallway with her sister behind her. Downstairs, she quietly went to work on the front door lock. There were so many keys, it took a long time to find the right one, but eventually she heard a loud thunk. The girls waited for several moments, sure that someone had heard, but when no sound came from upstairs, they scurried outside. "Goodbye, dollhouse," Daphne said sadly as she ran her hand lovingly across the door. "We'll go through the woods. We don't want anyone seeing us on the road and calling the police," Sabrina said, grabbing her sister's hand and leading her around to the back of the house. The girls looked into the dark forest in front of them. Crooked limbs twisted and turned in painful directions. Sabrina had the sense that the trees were horrible mutated guardians, threatening anyone who stepped onto their land. A cold wind whipped through the branches, bending some of the smaller trees over and making a breathy moan. Sabrina knew it was just her overactive imagination, but the woods seemed to be alive and reaching out for them. Behind them, the girls heard a surprised yelp, and Elvis suddenly appeared. He trotted over and planted himself between them and the trees. His happy face was now serious. "Go away, Elvis," Sabrina commanded, but the dog refused. "See, he doesn't think we should go either," said Daphne, as she wrapped her arms around the big dog and kissed him on the mouth. But Sabrina had made up her mind. She pulled her sister away and into the forest, with Elvis trotting after them. Inside the trees, everything was deadly still. There were no scurrying animals, rustling branches, or snapping twigs. Even the whistling breeze had faded away. It was as if someone had turned the volume down on the world. Suddenly, a high-pitched note filled the air. It seemed to come from deep inside the woods. "What was that?" Daphne said. Sabrina shrugged. Probably just the wind. Elvis whined loudly. Then he rushed to Sabrina and clamped his jaw into her coat sleeve, trying to yank her back toward the house. She pulled away. The girls hurried on with the dog close behind, barking warnings. Just ignore him. He'll go back when he gets bored, Sabrina said to herself as something zipped past her eye. She turned to get a better look and saw it was a firefly, just like the ones that had been outside their window earlier that night. Look, Daphne, here's the big menacing invader Mr. Skin and Bones was afraid would get into the house, Sabrina laughed. The little bug fluttered around her head and then circled her body. Pretty, Daphne said, only to find that she had her own little bug floating nearby. I've got one too. Elvis let out a very low growl. What's the matter, buddy? Daphne said as she scratched the dog's ears. This did nothing to soothe Elvis. The Great Dane howled menacingly and lunged at the lights with snapping teeth. Hush up, Sabrina ordered, but the dog wouldn't stop. He was going to wake Mrs. Grimm and Mr. Canis if he didn't calm down. Sabrina, Daphne said. The nervousness in the little girl's voice pulled Sabrina's attention away from the dog. Daphne had her hand over her nose, but what startled Sabrina was the fear in the little girl's eyes. She had seen the same look the morning after their parents disappeared, when they had woken up in their parents' bed alone. What's wrong? Sabrina asked. It just bit me, Daphne said as she removed her hand from her nose. It was covered in blood. Sabrina was shocked. Lightning bugs didn't bite. At least, no lightning bugs she had ever heard about. And at that moment, she felt a sting that brought blood to the top of her hand. Ouch! Daphne cried out, I got bit again! Blood trickled down her earlobe. Sabrina rushed over and wiped her sister's ear with her sleeve. The 2 bugs became 10, and then 100, and then a swarm that circled the girls. Thousands of angry little lights, zipping back and forth, diving at their heads and arms, and lighting up the ugly trees around them. Elvis growled at the bugs, but there was little he could do. Cover your face with your hands and run, Sabrina shouted. The 2 girls ran as fast as they could, with Elvis at their heels. Sabrina looked back, hoping the bugs weren't following, only to see the swarm close behind and gaining. In seconds, they were stinging the girls again. Daphne cried out and tripped over a tree root. She curled into a ball and tried to hide any exposed skin. Elvis leaped on top of the little girl, doing his best to cover her as the bugs dived, stinging her uncovered hands and legs. Sabrina had to do something. Elvis couldn't protect Daphne. She waved her hands and screamed at the bugs, and they instantly darted in her direction. She turned to run, but before she could take even a step, she slammed into something and fell to the ground. It was Mrs. Grimm. It's okay, Liebling, she said. We have to run, Mrs. Grimm, Sabrina cried, but the old woman stood calmly as if she was daring the bugs to come closer. When the swarm was nearly on top of them, the old woman raised her hand to her mouth and blew a soft blue dust into the air. Many of the bugs froze in mid-flight, falling to the ground like snowflakes. The blue mist took out half of their numbers. The rest regrouped and began to circle the old woman again. I have a whole house full of this, Mrs. Grimm shouted. Incredibly, the bugs seemed to weigh their options, and in one mass they darted deep into the woods and disappeared. That wasn't very nice, Mrs. Grimm shouted into the forest. She turned back to Sabrina and extended her hand. I'll need your help getting Daphne into the house. Sabrina was sure the old woman would be furious with them. There was no telling if her craziness could extend to violence. Who could tell what a woman who had swords hanging over her bed was capable of? But Mrs. Grimm didn't seem angry at all. In fact, she looked genuinely concerned. She asked Sabrina to undress her sister while the old woman rushed into the bathroom and returned with a bottle of calamine lotion and some cotton balls. She applied the lotion to Daphne's stings and tucked the little girl into bed. She'll be fine in the morning, maybe itchy, but fine, said Mrs. Grimm, as she handed the calamine lotion to Sabrina. Pixies are harmless unless you are overwhelmed by them. Did you just say pixies? Sabrina asked, unsure if the old woman was joking. Mrs. Grimm wrapped her arms around her and gave her a big hug. Liebling, it's okay now. You can stop crying. Sabrina wiped her face and felt the tears on her hand. She hadn't known she was crying. In the morning, Sabrina was as hungry as she had ever been, but she was still not going to eat. She'd already looked like a crybaby in front of the old lady. She wasn't about to give up any more ground. By the time the girls heard Mrs. Grimm calling them for breakfast, Sabrina had spent 20 minutes trying to explain her philosophy to her sister. "You can stay up here if you want, but I'm starving," said Daphne. The idea of skipping a meal was beyond the little girl's imagination. "We are not eating that woman's food," Sabrina said, her stomach growling. "We can't let her think she's breaking us down. We have to stay strong." "I have an idea," Daphne said. "Why don't we have breakfast, eat her cookies, play with Elvis, and enjoy the bed? She'll think she's won us over, and then one day, when she least expects it, we'll be gone." Sabrina thought about her sister's plan. She had to admit, it was pretty good. She just wished Daphne hadn't sounded so sarcastic when she said it. The girls got dressed and walked tentatively into the hallway. As they approached the stairs, Sabrina heard something coming from the locked room across from Mrs. Grimm's. It sounded like a voice, but she couldn't be sure. She put her head to the door, and the noise stopped. "Did you hear someone talking in there?" Sabrina asked her sister. "It was my belly. It's screaming for breakfast." Daphne grabbed Sabrina's hand and dragged her downstairs to the dining room. Much to Sabrina's relief, creepy Mr. Canis was nowhere to be seen. After several moments, Mrs. Grimm came out of the kitchen with a big plate of pancakes. "I hope everyone likes flapjacks," she sang. "Yum!" Daphne cheered as the old woman stacked 3 on her plate, along with a couple of sausage links, then turned to serve Sabrina, whose mouth was watering. Sabrina hadn't had pancakes since her parents disappeared. Her empty belly was telling her to seriously consider Daphne's plan. "Hold on, Lieblings, I forgot the syrup," Mrs. Grimm said, rushing back into the kitchen. As soon as she was gone, Daphne looked underneath her pancakes as if she were expecting a buried surprise. "They're just pancakes," she said. "You sound disappointed," Mrs. Grimm said, laughing as she returned with a large gravy boat. "Well, after last night's spaghetti, I thought maybe you cooked like that all the time," Daphne said wistfully. "Oh, Liebling, I do." The old woman tilted the gravy boat over Daphne's pancakes and a sticky, bright pink liquid bubbled out. To Sabrina, it looked like gelatin that hadn't had time to set. When Daphne saw it, her eyes grew as wide as the pancakes on her plate. "What's that?" she cried. "Try it," Mrs. Grimm said with a grin. Naturally, Daphne dug in, greedily wolfing down bite after bite. "It's delicious," she exclaimed with a mouthful of food. "It's a special recipe. It has marigolds in it." Mrs. Grimm proudly poured it onto Sabrina's pancakes before the girl had a chance to refuse. Sabrina looked down at the funky, fizzing sauce. It smelled faintly of peanut butter and mothballs, and Sabrina's stomach did a flip-flop in protest. She dropped her fork and pushed her plate away. Suddenly, there was a pounding from upstairs. "So, perhaps we should discuss last night's excitement," said Mrs. Grimm as she sat down at the table and tucked a napkin into the front of her bright green dress. She gazed across at Sabrina and arched a questioning eyebrow. "It wasn't my idea," Daphne said. Sabrina scowled at this betrayal. "Well, no harm done, no broken bones or anything," the old woman said. "Granny, you have some mean bugs in your yard," Daphne said as she poured more of the syrup on her breakfast. "I know, Liebling. They sure are mean." "What is that hammering?" asked Sabrina. "Mr. Canis is nailing your windows shut," Mrs. Grimm said as she took a bite of her breakfast. "What?" the girls said in shocked unison. "I can't take any chances that something could get into the house, or someone might try to get out," the old woman replied over the loud banging. "So, we're your prisoners?" Sabrina cried. "Oh, you're just like your Opa," Mrs. Grimm laughed. "What a flair for the dramatic. Let's put it behind us. Today's a new day with a new adventure. This morning I received a call. There's been an incident that requires our attention. How exciting. You two haven't even been here a full day yet, and already we're in the thick of it." "In the thick of what?" Daphne asked, as she placed a fat pat of green butter on her second stack of pancakes. You'll see. The old woman got up from her chair, went into the living room, and came back with several shopping bags. She placed them next to the table. Mr. Canis went to the store to buy you some clothing. Just a couple of things to tide you over until we can go shopping. Sabrina looked in the bag. Inside were some of the strangest clothes she had ever seen. There were 2 pairs of bright blue pants that had little hearts and balloons sewn onto them. There were 2 identical sweatshirts that were as awful as the pants, bright orange with a monkey and a tree on the front. Underneath the monkey were printed the words, "Hang in there." "You expect us to wear these?" Sabrina moaned. "Oh, I love them," Daphne said, pulling the orange monkey sweatshirt out and hugging it like a new doll. After breakfast, the girls got dressed and looked at their new outfits in the bedroom mirror. Daphne, of course, thought her crazy outfit was the best she had ever had and strutted around like a giddy fashion model. Sabrina, on the other hand, was sure Mr. Canis was trying to punish them for attempting to run away. "Hurry, girls, we have to get going," Granny called. "I feel like a movie star," Daphne said as the girls hurried downstairs. "You look like a mental patient," Sabrina remarked. The sisters stood by the door, waiting for the old woman to collect her things. Mrs. Grimm rushed around the house, grabbing books off of shelves and from underneath the couch, creating a tornado of dust that followed her from room to room. When she had collected as many as she could carry, she handed them to Sabrina. "Almost ready," she sang as she rushed up the stairs. Sabrina looked down at the top book. It was entitled Fables and Folklore, the Complete Handbook. Before she could question the book's purpose, she heard the old woman pull out her keys and unlock the mysterious door upstairs. "She's going into her secret room," Sabrina whispered to her sister. Daphne's eyes widened and she bit the palm of her hand. For some reason, Daphne did this whenever she was overly excited, and though it embarrassed Sabrina, she let it pass. If she tried to curb all of Daphne's odd quirks, she would never get any sleep. "I wonder what's in there," Daphne whispered back. "That's probably where she keeps the bodies of all the other kids she's stolen from the orphanage." Daphne stuck out her tongue and gave her sister a raspberry. Sabrina had to admit she was curious about the room. Whenever she was told she couldn't do something, Sabrina found it was all she could think about doing. But the great thing about rules was that you could break them and drive adults crazy. "Do you hear that?" Daphne asked. "Yeah, she's talking to someone," Sabrina replied. "Probably Mr. Canis." Sabrina strained to hear the conversation, but before she could make out anything, she heard Mrs. Grimm leave the room, lock the door, and head back down the stairs. "Ladies, we're off," she said as she ushered them outside and went to work locking the front door. Then she knocked on the door 3 times, as she had the day before, but this time she said, "We'll be back." "Who are you talking to?" Sabrina asked. "The house," Mrs. Grimm replied, as if this were a perfectly natural thing to do. Daphne knocked on the door as well. "Goodbye, dollhouse," she said, causing her sister to sigh and roll her eyes. As they turned to go to the car, Sabrina looked up and nearly stumbled. Mr. Canis wasn't upstairs. He was standing on the path with Elvis at his side. He returned her stare with a look of slight contempt. His gaze unnerved the girl, but no more than the realization that Mrs. Grimm had been talking to herself in her secret room. "We're ready, Mr. Canis," Mrs. Grimm said, and he nodded. They all climbed into the squeaky car, including Elvis, who laid his huge body across the girls' laps. "Did you have a chat with our neighbor?" Mrs. Grimm asked Mr. Canis as they all buckled or tied themselves in. "We began a conversation," the old man grumbled, "but he can be stubborn." "Well, he'll get used to it eventually, I suppose," Mrs. Grimm replied. "He doesn't have a history of getting used to things," Mr. Canis said. Mrs. Grimm sighed and nodded. "Who are you talking about?" Daphne asked. "Oh, just a neighbor, nothing to worry about. You'll meet him soon enough." Sabrina looked around. She was sure they were miles from their nearest neighbor. Mr. Canis fired up the engine and the car rocked back and forth violently like a bucking bronco trying to get rid of a cowboy, calming down as they drove out the driveway and through the desolate backwoods. Sabrina re-examined Ferryport Landing, the world's most boring town. There was little obvious life, except an old dairy cow standing on the side of the road. Mrs. Grimm leaned over and honked, then waved wildly at the cow as they passed. When Daphne giggled about it, the old woman smiled and told her how important it was to be friendly. Meanwhile, Sabrina made the best of the trip by memorizing street names and calculating how long it would take to walk to the train station. They came to a mailbox with the name Appleby marked on it, and Mr. Canis turned the car down a long, leaf-covered driveway lined with ancient cedars, pines, and oaks. The car passed a tractor sitting alone on a little hill, and pulled over into a clearing where a massive pile of wood and pipes and glass sat surrounded by yellow emergency tape. Mrs. Grimm looked at Mr. Canis and smiled. "Well, we haven't had to deal with something like this in a while, have we, Mr. Canis?" she asked. The old man shook his head and helped her out of the car. Once she got on her feet, Mrs. Grimm opened the back door, reached in, and scratched Elvis behind the ears. "Girls, do you mind if I borrow my boyfriend for a moment?" she asked as she winked at Daphne. The Great Dane crawled clumsily out of the car, stretched a little, and looked up at the old woman for instructions. She fumbled in her purse and took out a small piece of fabric that she held under the dog's nose. He sniffed it deeply, then rushed over to the huge pile of debris and began hunting through the rubble. "What are we doing here?" Sabrina asked. "We're investigating a crime, naturally," Mrs. Grimm said. "Are you a police officer or something?" asked Daphne. "Or something," the old woman said with a grin. "Why don't you get out and take a look around?" She walked away, apparently to snoop through the rubble. Having a 200-pound dog lie on her lap had given Sabrina a Charlie horse, so she and Daphne decided to get out and stretch their legs. "She talks to the house and cows and has all these crazy rules. Now she thinks she's Sherlock Holmes," Sabrina muttered. "Maybe it's a game," Daphne said. "I'm going to be a detective too. I'm going to be Scooby-Doo." Despite all of Sabrina's warnings, Daphne seemed to be having fun, something she hadn't had in nearly a year and a half. It was nice to see a smile on her sister's face and that old light in her eyes. It was the same look she used to have when their father would read them the Sunday comics, or when their mother would let them invade her closet to play dress-up. Sabrina smiled and put her arm around the little girl's shoulders. She'd let her have her fun. Who knew how long it would last? Alright, this is still not actually the end of chapter 2, but this is a longer chapter than I thought, so I'm going to cut it off here, and I will read more of the next chapter for the beginning of next week. Bye, guys!